This video is brought to you by Nebula and TLDR's Race Across Europe. We're now nearly a week into Ukraine's much anticipated counteroffensive, and things are really starting to heat up. While Ukraine is yet to commit its full forces, both sides are engaging more and more troops in search of a breakthrough, especially in Zaporizhzhia. So in this video, we're going to take a look at what's happened on the battlefield since our last video, assess how the counteroffensive has gone so far, and ask what might happen next. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So before we get into it, as we said in our last video, we know that the Ukrainian armed forces have requested operational silence, but nothing in this video violates that or could put Ukrainian troops at risk. All the information here is coming from Russian Telegram channels, and it's stuff that Russian military bloggers, let alone the Kremlin, are already aware of. So let's start with the places where Ukraine has made gains. As we see it, there are three places Ukraine has made significant gains: Bakhmut, Zaporizhzhia, and the western part of Donetsk. Let's start with Bakhmut, where the Ukrainians have made significant gains to the south of the city. As we said in our previous video, the Ukrainians have been advancing on the flanks to the north and the south of the city, and last week they reached the suburbs of Berkivka and Klishchivka. In the last few days, while they haven't made much more progress in the north, the Ukrainians have advanced a couple more kilometers in the south, and it looks like they've moved north from the outskirts of Klishchivka into the southernmost bit of Bakhmut itself. While the actual volume of the territory recaptured is pretty minimal, the fact that the Ukrainians are already back in Bakhmut itself doesn't bode well for the Russian army, and it won't go down well with the Wagner Group or their leader Yevgeny Prigozhin, who's complained multiple times about the Russian army's incompetence. In Zaporizhzhia, the Ukrainians have made minor gains across the entire front line. As we argued in our previous video, Ukraine's push in Zaporizhzhia looks like it might be their main offensive for a couple of reasons. First, it's where the most Ukrainian troops are currently concentrated. Second, it's where we've seen the majority of Ukraine's latest tech, including Leopard tanks and Bradley armoured vehicles. And third, a Ukrainian advance in Zaporizhzhia, probably towards Tokmak, would be a real strategic gain for Ukraine. Tokmak is a key rail hub for the Russians in the south, so its loss would put a serious strain on Russia's logistics, and possibly presage a further Ukrainian advance down to either Melitopol or Mariupol. Anyway, here the Ukrainians have advanced a few kilometers in a couple of places, taking a series of small towns along the front line. The best way to understand Ukraine's advances here is to think about them in terms of Russia's defensive lines. Basically, presumably because a successful Ukrainian push here would threaten Russia's land bridge to Crimea, Zaporizhzhia is where Russia has the most fortifications. Satellite imagery suggests that Russia has two defensive lines in the east of Zaporizhzhia and three in the west. These defensive lines are composed of various fortifications, including trenches, shelters, anti-tank obstacles, and minefields. Certain strategically significant towns, including Tokmak, are entirely surrounded by circular ditches that can house anti-tank teams. Anyway, Ukraine has made steady progress along the front line, advancing on an average of a couple of kilometers across the entire line. But as of Monday afternoon, they're still at least 10 kilometers away from Russia's first defensive line. It looks like the Ukrainians have had more success in the western parts of Donetsk, where they've advanced south from Velika Novosilka down towards Starolnivka. At the time of writing, it looks like Starolnivka is still under Russian control, but if Ukraine can take it, the Russians will probably have to flee to their first defensive line, roughly 10 kilometers further south. Now, the fact that Ukraine haven't made rapid gains and that a non-trivial number of Western-supplied armoured vehicles have been destroyed in the fighting has provoked some anxiety in the pro-Ukraine parts of the internet. But the truth is that it's just too early to judge the success of the counteroffensive with any certainty. This one was never going to be anything like the Kharkiv offensive, not least because the Russians have had months to prepare fortifications. And in a way, what happened last year has set expectations unrealistically high. It's also worth saying that, while we have indeed seen some Leopard and Bradleys on the battlefield, Ukraine is still yet to deploy its full force. A Ukrainian armoured battalion normally has 31 tanks, or roughly the same number of armoured vehicles, as well as a couple more for carrying specialist infantry. Given that a brigade would likely have been between 4 and 5 battalions in total, then an armoured brigade is going to have something like 200 armoured vehicles of various types. Assuming the main offensive involves at least a few brigades, this means we should expect to see hundreds of vehicles concentrated in a narrow front. And this clearly hasn't happened yet, which suggests the Ukrainians are still holding back at least some of their firepower. Some analysts have even suggested that the small number of Leopard and Bradleys we've seen so far could be part of a feint to convince the Russians to commit all of their forces in Zaporizhzhia. Now, this doesn't mean that we should expect an enormous Ukrainian force to come and easily overwhelm the Russians. Clearly, the current offensive is still occupying a significant fraction of Ukraine's firepower. All we're saying is that, while things aren't going as well as they did in Kharkiv or Kherson, this should be unsurprising, and it's just too early to declare success or failure. Looking forward though, whether the counteroffensive can succeed really depends on 3 things. First, how much Ukraine and Russia are holding back. Neither side is yet to commit its full force, and a lot will depend on how much firepower they've got left. Second, how solid Russia's defensive lines are. If Russia really does have 3 well-prepared defensive lines in Zaporizhzhia, then reaching Tokmak will be a real slog for Ukraine. If, however, the collapse of Russia's first defensive line triggers a domino effect, or Russia's second and third defensive lines aren't as solid, Ukraine might be able to use the momentum of its first advance to take it all the way to Tokmak. Third, it depends on relations between the Russian army and the various private military companies that support it. As we've explained in other videos, relations between the Russian Ministry of Defense and especially the Wagner Group have been deteriorating recently, and last week the MOD announced its intention to basically fold Wagner and other PMCs into the formal Russian army. This will probably exacerbate the internal feud between the MOD and its PMCs, and could end up affecting Russia's abilities on the battlefield. There's also some other huge news, by the way. We've just launched our new series, TLDR's Race Across Europe. Take a look.
To celebrate the 10,000th order from the TLDR merch store, we committed to hand-delivering orders to a bunch of real TLDR fans. So, we split into 3 teams, assigned points to each delivery location on the map, and let teams try to score as many points as they could in just 30 hours. The problem? Well, only 1 team is allowed to make each delivery, and any team which doesn't make it to the location of the 10,000th order by the end of the game is disqualified. Welcome to TLDR's Race Across Europe.
I'm a speed demon now.
Why is British transport the worst?
Oh no! I'm going to be fuming if they beat us this one.
Zach is obviously thinking, he's like, nah, Ben's not a threat, nah, you know?
It's gonna look like it is when we lose.
Have you spoken to any other teams?
Guys, it's not looking good.
And thank you for ruining our journey.
This is the worst thing that could have happened.
And I wouldn't put it past him, he's a spiteful little...
What? What do you mean? What? How does that happen? We've come through some kind of police barricade.
Genuinely very much an open question as to whether or not Jack gets back to the UK anytime soon.
Yeah.
It was within an hour.
That's not possible. Did you have a ticket? Who's got the tickets? Oh, I'm so sorry.
Now, you can watch the first episode on the TLDR EU channel right now, but we're also releasing every subsequent episode a week early on Nebula. So if you're a Nebula subscriber, you can watch the first 2 episodes right now, totally ad-free. That's true of all TLDR content, by the way. We regularly release our videos on Nebula before they come to YouTube, and everything's ad-free, so not even this advert is here. It's not just the race either. Every week, TLDR produces well over an hour's worth of content, which is exclusively for Nebula. That's exclusive discussions where our team share their thoughts on the latest stories, extended daily briefings, our Nebula series This Week in Parliament, and even full explainers. So if you want the full TLDR experience, you really ought to be on Nebula. Sign up now using our link in the description to get everything the platform has to offer for just £2 a month.